An elderly black woman was handcuffed on a busy Atlanta street for nothing more than walking with her cane. The officer, Brian Keller, dismissed her dignity with arrogance, blind to who she truly was. But one voice in the crowd sparked a revelation that turned the entire scene upside down. And just wait until you hear the stunning twist that brought this injustice to its knees, and why justice, in the end, prevailed. Tuesday mornings in downtown Atlanta usually passed without notice. Office workers hurried with coffee in hand, buses hissed as they pulled into stops, and the sound of horns blended into a restless symphony. On the corner of Peachtree Street, an elderly black woman stepped off the curb. She walked with the help of a cane, her steps careful, deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Her gray wool coat swayed lightly with each move, and her small leather handbag was tucked close against her side. To anyone else, she was just another face in the crowd. But not to Officer Brian Keller. Sitting in his patrol car, his gaze locked on her. Something about her, in his eyes, was wrong. She looked, as he muttered to himself, out of place. That thought alone was enough. With a flick of a switch, red and blue lights flashed against the shop windows, scattering their reflections across the glass. The shrill chirp of the siren startled pedestrians as Keller pulled up to the curb. He stepped out with a kind of swagger that suggested the decision had already been made in his mind. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding, "you can't just walk across the street wherever you please. That's jaywalking." The woman paused, leaning on her cane, and turned toward him. Her eyes carried both patience and quiet strength, the look of someone who had lived through decades of struggle and knew the value of composure. Her voice, calm and even, held no defiance. "Officer, I crossed with the light. The signal was green." But Keller wasn't interested in explanations. He cut her off, shaking his head, his tone laced with impatience. "Don't play smart with me. People like you think the rules don't apply." The crowd around them began to notice. A man on his way to work slowed down, earbuds dangling, his brows furrowing. A young woman pushing a stroller stopped a few steps away, watching carefully. The atmosphere thickened, like the city itself was holding its breath. Without warning, Keller stepped forward. His hand gripped her wrist with a firmness that was far too harsh for someone of her age. The sharp clink of metal broke the silence as he snapped handcuffs around her frail wrists. The sound echoed, cold and final, cutting through the murmurs of the street. The woman winced slightly, but did not raise her voice. Her dignity remained intact, even as steel bound her hands. That quiet resilience only made the scene more jarring. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Why is he arresting her?" someone whispered. "She didn't do anything wrong," another voice murmured. Phones came out. Screens lit up, recording every second. Some pedestrians shook their heads. Others stood frozen, torn between disbelief and anger. Cars slowed as drivers craned their necks to witness the scene. An elderly lady, treated like a criminal in the heart of the city, it was unthinkable. The moment burned itself into everyone's memory. Outrage spread through the crowd like fire, silent at first, then heavy, suffocating, undeniable. It wasn't just about one woman, it was about what she represented, and the way she was being dismissed, disrespected, and shackled on a public street. Her name was Justice Eleanor Whitfield, though Officer Keller had no idea. To him, she was just another elderly woman he could push around. But Eleanor's story was written across the fabric of America itself. At 74, her life had been shaped by years when the South carried scars of open segregation. She remembered walking past whites-only signs as a child, clutching her mother's hand tightly, trying to understand why the world had already drawn lines against her. Through perseverance, she rose. When law schools turned her away, she studied harder, applied again and again. Professors who doubted her brilliance became silent when she outperformed entire classes. She argued cases that chipped away at barriers designed to hold people back. And finally, after decades of persistence, she earned a seat on the nation's highest court. A position that symbolized not just her triumph, but the triumph of generations who had fought for dignity. Yet on this street corner, none of that mattered. The cold weight of handcuffs dug into her skin. Her cane lay abandoned on the sidewalk. Her hands, once used to sign landmark opinions that shaped the future of justice, were now bound behind her as if she were a criminal. She had spent her life commanding courtrooms, yet here she stood powerless in front of a man who never cared to ask her name. The humiliation stung sharper than the cuffs. Around her, the crowd had grown larger. A middle-aged man shook his head in disbelief. A young mother whispered softly, "That's wrong. She's not even resisting." Murmurs spread, echoing the same sentiment, each word adding another layer to the tension hanging in the air. In that moment, the pain wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who witnessed it, the quiet ache of seeing dignity stripped away in broad daylight. To the onlookers, it was more than one officer's arrogance. It was the image of unchecked authority crushing grace, history, and wisdom in a single careless act. And Justice Whitfield, who had spent her life fighting to uphold the very laws Keller swore to protect, felt the bitter irony cut deep. After everything, after all her victories, she was once again reduced to just an old black woman in the eyes of someone who refused to see her humanity. Officer Keller tightened his grip as he guided the woman toward the open door of his squad car. The metallic door creaked, the leather seat waiting like a trap. To onlookers, it felt like the end, an elderly woman being swallowed whole by a system too blind to see its mistake. A low murmur rippled through the gathering crowd, uneasy and defeated. And then, a single voice broke the silence. "Wait, do you know who this is?" shouted a young man near the front. His suit jacket was slightly rumpled, a briefcase clutched under his arm. He was a junior attorney, fresh out of law school, and his eyes widened as recognition struck him like lightning. He had studied her face in textbooks, quoted her dissents in class, admired her for years. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The officer glanced back, confused, dismissive, but the crowd leaned in. A whisper became a wave. "She's not just anyone," someone murmured. "That's Justice Whitfield," the attorney said again, louder this time, his voice carrying urgency. Cameras rose higher. Phone flashes lit the air like fireflies. The weight of the name began to settle. Justice Eleanor Whitfield, Supreme Court of the United States. The reaction was electric. People who moments earlier had watched in quiet despair now surged with energy. Strangers exchanged wide-eyed glances. A barista from the corner cafe dropped his apron and ran closer. A pair of college students pressed forward, their phones already streaming live. The officer's face, once smug with certainty, began to falter. His jaw clenched, his grip on the handcuffs loosened just slightly as the realization of what he'd done began to seep in. "She's a justice of the Supreme Court," a woman's voice rang out from the crowd, firm and clear, cutting through the noise. The words echoed like a verdict delivered on the spot, each syllable heavy with authority. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. What had been a scene of humiliation now pulsed with defiance and expectation. The despair that weighed down the onlookers transformed into hope, alive and visible in their eyes. This wasn't going to be just another story of power abused, quietly forgotten. Something larger was unfolding, and everyone present knew they were witnessing it. The precinct walls were sterile and cold, humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. Justice Eleanor Whitfield sat on a metal bench, her wrists still bound in cuffs that never should have been placed on her. Yet she didn't slump or break. She waited, calm, steady, unshaken. When Officer Keller passed by, still wearing that thin layer of confidence, she finally lifted her gaze. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "Officer Keller," she said evenly, "you have no idea the storm you've brought on yourself." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They carried the authority of a lifetime spent upholding the law, and the echo of every injustice she had already overcome. Minutes later, his supervisors arrived, called in by a flood of messages, phone alerts, and urgent demands from higher offices. By then, the story had already escaped the precinct walls. Footage from the street filled television screens across the nation. Clips went viral, headlines blazed, Supreme Court justice arrested without cause. The evidence was undeniable. By the end of the day, Keller's badge was suspended. The smug certainty that once carried him through the crowd had vanished, replaced with the crushing reality of accountability. But for Justice Whitfield, triumph didn't come in his punishment. It came days later when she stepped once more onto the marble floor of the Supreme Court. Cameras lined the halls, but she ignored them. Her cane tapped firmly with each step, a steady rhythm echoing through the chamber. She took her seat on the bench, head held high, her expression composed yet unyielding. She didn't need to deliver speeches, nor demand revenge. Her presence alone was enough, a living reminder that dignity cannot be broken by arrogance. For millions who watched, she became more than a judge. She became a symbol, a beacon of resilience, proof that truth, even when silenced or shackled, always rises again. And for Officer Brian Keller, the lesson was carved into history. Never underestimate the power of the person you try to diminish, because sometimes the very one you dismiss is the one who defines justice itself.